So we're fudging things a little here by straying outside of strictly film into what is technically a mini-series, shown in 2 parts on HBO in the USA and BBC4, I think, in the UK. But it's worth tweaking the entrance criteria for such an outstanding piece of documentary filmmaking. Filmed from the middle of 2005, right after Hurricane Katrina had laid waste the city of New Orleans, When the Levees Broke, a requiem in 4 acts, is both a heartbreaking look at the devastation caused to the community of one of the most artistically and culturally vibrant and influential cities in the United States, and an excoriating investigation of the failures of planning, management and response that caused the disaster and brutally exacerbated its consequences. The interviewees, which include engineers, volunteers, residents, families of victims, journalists and broadcasters, and the New Orleans mayor and Louisiana governor, together tell the tale of what happened. Starting with a population unwilling to heed storm warnings they had heard before that had come to nothing, or, more commonly, were financially unable to respond to, even in the face of the mandatory evacuation order given by the mayor. We follow events to the Category 5 hurricane, and then the storm surge that overwhelmed the levees and inundated large parts of the city. Things move on from the initial destruction to the extra death and chaos caused by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and their underwhelming, slow, inappropriate, inadequate, scattershot, and in the early days, entirely absent response. And then the return to the city of some of the residents and the scenes of utter devastation that awaited them. The latter portion of Levees deals with what may be the greatest tragedy of Hurricane Katrina, at least in the longer term, the gutting of the city's population. Families were distributed and separated all around the US, endangering the culture of one of the country's most unique cities, something the USA can ill afford. It's a very even-handed documentary. For example, some of the earlier interviews talk about a theory that the levees had been intentionally dynamited to intentionally flood the city, either to affect property prices or save richer neighbourhoods. And these are presented in a fairly non-judgmental way and are balanced by further interviews that suggest the truth. The explosions many people reported were likely sections of flood defences giving way under the weight of water, or the impact of a large unmoored barge that caused significant damage. But this is no jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams nonsense. These 2 threads are followed by a brief history lesson explaining how not far-fetched the deliberate destruction theory is. The interviews, there and elsewhere, are from all classes and creeds, rich and poor alike, the documentary taking care to show that this was a tragedy that affected a whole city, though while not denying the obvious facts that some people had it worse. Aside from the tragedy at the heart of it, there were a few moments of wry amusement to be had in looking back now, like the quaint notion that George W. Bush was the worst president in US history, likewise his administration, and the sight of Kanye West criticising a US president for hating black people, rather than donning one of his hats and supporting him. What the hell happened there? It runs to 4.25 hours, and as its TV broadcast would suggest, wasn't intended to be seen in one sitting, so don't let the length put you off. But even still, I still found it captivating and informative, and enraging, of course, and watched it again in one sitting without ever noticing the running time. It's simply excellent.
Yes, another winner from the Spike Lee documentary camp. I was glad that the more tinfoil-hatted stuff got a fairly short shrift, and because the reality of what actually happened was much more affecting. And I mean, we all saw the pictures of what was happening in New Orleans at the time, but what I didn't really have a lot of understanding of was the fallout from it. The way that families seemed to be divided up essentially at random and posted off to bits of the country. That was a bit of a surprise to me and seemed entirely unjustified. I'm not sure what the rationale for that was. That's a very strange thing to have done. But thankfully, of course, the US has learned from these kind of massive public health crises and would never do something as ridiculous as this again.
They deal with families so much better, Scott. I mean, it's not a country that would, for instance, have baby cages.
Where do you even buy a baby cage? Yes. I don't have a lot to critically analyse in this, to be honest with you. It's a really well-made documentary that's really quite affecting of a very important subject, and almost everything that it brings up still hasn't really been properly remedied by anything in the intervening time. Quite how the level of response was so bad is something that, I'm sure there's been reports into it, but they don't really seem to have come into any answers other than, I don't know. So it was bad. I don't know what the fixes for this kind of thing are, and whether we've learned their lessons with flood defences and all that kind of thing, which is only ever going to get more important as things go on and ocean levels rise. Yeah, I don't know. It didn't leave me in a particularly optimistic frame of mind, this. So that's not really the documentary's fault as much as is the kind of inevitable result of what's happened in the intervening time. So yes, but it's a really well-made film and something that is well worth taking a look at. Yeah,
I need to check out the sort of follow-up, which is made 4 or 5 years later, called "If God Is Willing and the Creek Don't Rise." Mm-hmm. It'd actually be quite nice to see if Spike Lee go back maybe now, a decade after this first return.
Yeah,
see how things are, but I don't have a lot of hope that they're great.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. There are very few criticisms to be made about the documentary, if any at all. The criticisms are all to do with humans and politics and human nature and stuff. One moment I was particularly struck by, and it's not unusual for me to be bothered by this, and it's certainly not uncommon to see it. I think it's Act 3 that opens with people talking. Particularly, there's one woman who, in fact, ignore that because I can't remember what her name is, so it doesn't matter. Act 3 in particular, Scott, is opened by people talking about their faith, and you see some church services and people praying and stuff, and that just enrages me because it's the problem with religion, and I think that sometimes people, I mean, there are slightly more malicious things that use religion to control people, but I think people think that people put up with their lot because that religion teaches them to, and they accept that and they find that quite convenient.
Yeah. Because
the whole tone of the beginning of Act 3 is basically people saying, people who've had the worst things happen to them and through no fault of their own at all, entirely innocent people, and as much as any individual human can be innocent in a capitalist democracy, but basically, this is my life and I should accept it because God is good and he has a plan. Mm-hmm. And there's so many people who say this, and okay, I understand that people find comfort in religion and things, but I'm looking at this documentary showing the most horrendous things that happen, all these shots of bodies left in the water for weeks and weeks and weeks and months, even in some cases inside the houses. And I'm thinking, no, what you should be saying, use the same words and change your tone. This is my life and I should accept it because God is good and he has a plan. I don't. Okay, to be fair, it's not necessarily going to serve any purpose, but I don't understand why these people are angry instead of accepting.
Well, you're saying you'd be upset if I came to you saying, look, I've got a plan for you, right? What I'm going to do is flood your house and kill your family. Does that sound reasonable? You're on board with that?
Well, if some book of fairy tales written a couple thousand years ago says so, Scott, then yes.
I'll reward you in the next life.
but that is a rant for another time. Or if you know me, many, many other times. But I'll keep it with this. It's just that the film is
Thoughts on theology. Thoughts on theology.
It's just that the film is demonstrating, it's like, just the way people deal with these things, and it honestly just enrages me sometimes. Because I think the real villains of the piece, the government that didn't do what it should have done, FEMA that didn't do what it should have done, the fact that the revenues that should make that one of the richest states in the union actually don't go anywhere near the state.
Yeah.
And these people don't have a house anymore and their families are 1,000 miles away. And they're going, oh, well, I've got my faith. Like, that just enrages, and it saddens me too. Like, no, get angry.
Yeah.
You should get angry and not accepting this. But again, that's a human nature thing, unfortunately, rather than an issue with this film. The film itself is excellent. It's very affecting, and it really is very evenly handed. I mean, there's plenty of anger to be brought out of or caused by it, but it's not artificial.
No, it's all incredibly well justified.
Yes, exactly.